I was giving a seminar recently to couples, married and otherwise, and one of the questions came up when I talked about how couples really aren't often arguing about what they think they're arguing about. If they're not really talking about chores, sex, kids, money, these big four that we talk about with couples, if it's not really about that, then what is it that it's really about? And so I showed them a diagram in this seminar where you have an iceberg and you have the small part of the iceberg that's stuck up out of the water and the much larger part of the iceberg that is submerged below. And the top part of the iceberg that's stuck out on top, the smaller part, is what couples think they're arguing about. They think they're arguing about, as I said, chores or sex or kids or money or the burrito or whose turn it is to wash the dishes or these different topics that can entangle all couples in all kinds of relationships and that can cause ruptures and often don't get repaired. And the reason they often don't get repaired is because the couple is not talking about the part that is submerged below the iceberg and below the water, which is feeling supported or feeling unworthy or abandoned or rejected or feeling unloved or feeling not good enough. Those are the things that are really what the couple is arguing about. And so I also said that couples have to learn how to discuss these ruptures and identify what's really happening for them on two different levels. The first level that couples can talk about ruptures is the level of the event. And they can go around and around and around and talk about who said what to whom and in what order. And by the way, there was a previous podcast on this very thing right here, talking about it from a second level communication. The first level is to talk about it at the level of the event. Couples have to be able to learn to talk about things at the level of the relationship, which is what I'm calling a level 2. And that is the feelings and the perceptions of what happened, not the actual events themselves. But probably most importantly is couples have to be able to identify the attachment wound that has been triggered for them in these ruptures. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How to identify an attachment wound. If it's not about chores, sex, money, kids, so on and so forth, if we're talking about things at the level of the relationship, feeling supported, loved, feeling cared for, then how do we get to the root of the problem? How do we really identify what's happening so that it can be discussed at that second level and those repairs can be made, which we know science tells us over and over and over again. When you make repairs, you build trust and you create resilience in your relationships. So the question is, how do we get to the root of the problem? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get started.
Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast that provides support and guidance to help heal the wounds of attachment trauma. Whether you find yourself struggling with unresolved issues in the past or have experienced trauma in your current relationship, our goal is to provide accurate, scientifically informed information as well as the tools to help you create a secure connection between you and your partner. And here's your host, Tom Philp.
Okay, we're talking about how to get to the root of the problem. And one of the things we have to do is we have to be able to discern what the argument or the disruption is actually about, which means that more often than not, and I would say at least 80% of the time, it's because there's an attachment wound that has been triggered here. So what is an attachment wound? Well, it's basically an emotional wound. And more often than not, it's an unrepaired injury, something that either has occurred earlier in the relationship or something that has occurred outside of the relationship that an individual brought into the current relationship. Could be from family of origin, could have been from a first love, could have been from an adolescence, boyfriend or girlfriend that cheated on them, and they told themselves they would never be that vulnerable again, and so on and so forth. But these unrepaired injuries that sort of stick in the bone marrow of who we are, we just can't quite get over them. They create a deep enough wound that they can be triggered in any of our relationships, especially with our attachment partners. As I said, they usually occur in our primary relationships. When they get touched or poked at, they are fiercely protected, especially when it feels like those wounds are going to be exposed. They also shape our adult relationships because they shape the view of ourselves and the view of our partner. So we've carried those wounds around long enough that they actually can spill into our adult relationships at times when we get triggered through the expectations that we set for ourselves and for others. And I think it's important to note that there are two sides to an attachment wound or an attachment injury. The first side is a repeated, dreaded, hurtful side. It's, oh my gosh, I'm going to get the same thing that I've always gotten. I'm going to feel unwanted. I'm going to feel unloved. I'm going to feel uncared for, not a priority. This is the dreadful, hurtful side of the attachment wound. But there's also a longed for or hopeful side, which is, I hope that my partner is going to respond differently this time. I hope that when this feeling comes up, that there will be some kind of repair, some different experience I can get from my partner that would tell me something different about myself and create any kind of repair that I've never gotten before. And so there are two sides to an attachment injury. And in fact, both these sides play out in tandem in our relationships. When we are getting dysregulated, when we're raising our voices, when we're getting very emotional, part of that is because we're protesting. We're saying, my gosh, my love, can't you hear me? Can't you hear how I'm protesting? Can't you see how much I'm hoping to get something different from you in this moment? And so they have two different sides that play off each other, very much like two sides of the same coin. You can't have one side without the other, and they're both present. And it's not so much, this is important too, the attachment injury is not so much the actual injury that happened, but actually what happens inside of us that creates the injury. It is our perception of that injury, and it is how we carry that burden around with us that creates so much of the trauma. And so when triggered, old wounds prevent repairs. So how do we get to the root of the problem? We have to be able to understand what is being triggered for me here, and can I identify this long enough to be able to communicate from that place. One of my favorite quotes is from William Faulkner. He says, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And I think that applies so perfectly here. When we get locked in these cycles, when there's ruptures we have in our relationship, that past comes alive in us. And it comes alive in terms of attachment wounds. And we need to be able to identify what those attachment wounds are. So how do we recognize an attachment wound? We kind of described what it is, some components of it, but what does it actually look like or show up as in our relationships? Well, one of the ways is that it could be easily triggered. We could become emotionally dysregulated quite often in our relationships. We might find ourselves being excessively defensive. So do you feel a shift in your body, and do you feel yourself becoming defensive quite often in your relationship? If so, there may be a wound that's being poked at there. Does the same feelings keep coming up? Shame, guilt, pain, hurt, etc. So do you recognize that, oh, here's that same feeling again. I'm feeling unworthy. I'm feeling unloved. I'm feeling not a priority to my partner. So recognize that there could be some thematic feelings that come up for you over and over. And if so, that may help you understand more of what that attachment wound is. Are you sensitive to being abandoned or feeling rejected by your partner? Are you consistently insecure? Do you feel like you need your partner to be close? Do you find yourself being somewhat clingy to your partner? Or on the opposite side, do you overvalue your independence? Does your partner feel smothering when they want to get closer to you and you find yourself pushing and pulling away? Mistrust of your partner and mistrust of yourself is another way to recognize an attachment wound. Do you feel like there's this gut response, like when my partner says they love me or they had a good time with me? Is there something inside that just says, I don't know if I can trust that? Oh, that they're just saying that. Do you find you make excuses for your partner's words of love and words of affirmation to you? Oh, they said I'm pretty, but they really don't mean I'm pretty. Or they said I'm handsome, and she really doesn't think I'm handsome. She's just with me because of these other reasons, whatever that might be. So there's this little gut response that can't believe other people, that mistrusts their intentions. How about excessive reliance on your partner for soothing, comfort, or nurturance? Or, as I said, excessive independence? Or how about a disproportionate reaction to a situation? I'm in my studio here and I'm raising my hand. You can't see this because, boy, I've sure done that one. My partner says something and it triggers something in me, and all of a sudden all this emotion comes up and it spills out into the relationship, and it kind of comes out of nowhere, and it's a completely disproportionate reaction to the situation. And so that's some of the ways that we can begin to recognize an attachment wound. When we're able to recognize that, then what we're able to do is actually then be able to discern, what's this really about? What's really going on here? I think I've mentioned on my podcast before the couple that had a huge knockdown dragout fight over a burrito. And if you've listened to my podcast at all, you know I'm a big fan of saying it's not about that. It's about this. It's not about what's above the iceberg. It's about what's below the iceberg. And so that burrito just simply represented that when I ask my partner or tell my partner things, I'm never listened to. And that feeling was a theme in that relationship. It was an unrepaired wound that kept coming up. So the burrito was just the straw that broke the camel's back in that particular case, because that person really wasn't angry about the burrito. That was a solvable problem. He could eat something else. They could go get another burrito. No big deal. But what it was about was his partner being able to recognize, yes, there are times when you tell me you want or need something and I don't meet that need for you. And when that happens, you feel not seen in this relationship, not seen by me. And because I'm important, because I love you, because I'm your significant person, the most significant person in your life, not being seen by me hurts. And that's a wound that keeps coming up over and over and over. So that's sort of an example of how our feelings and these thematic thoughts can come back up over and over in a relationship and point us towards the actual wound that might be being triggered in our disruptions. And when that happens, we have a much, much better chance of being able to then drill down and get to the root of the problem in our ruptures. So here's an exercise I want you to try, my dear listeners. And so create a grid on a sheet of paper. I want 5 columns, and let's just start with 5 rows. And so at the top of the first column on the left side of the page, I want you to put down interaction. And then the next column, feeling. And then the next column, primary or secondary emotion. And then the fourth column, I want you to write story. And finally, on the last column on the right, write need. So what I want you to do then is use this as a little template to help yourself think about the interactions you have with your partner and what actually happens. Are there feelings and are there the same thoughts that come up for me that I'm not getting certain needs met in my relationship? And if so, this might be able to funnel down more clearly for you what some of these disruptions and ruptures are about in your relationship. My guess is when you have a rupture with your partner, some of these themes are coming up and they're being poked at, or your partner's getting too close to an area that is an old wound, and you immediately move into a place of protection, and you might have disproportionate reactions to your partner at times. So an example might be interaction. We were having dinner tonight. My partner said something that was a tone of voice, that used a tone of voice that brought up anger for me. And so that was the feeling. Primary, secondary. Well, if I think about this and reflect on it, that was a secondary emotion. I got angry because the tone of voice signaled something to me that actually was more hurtful. So I used a secondary emotion, but the primary emotion was actually more hurt. And the story I'm telling myself about that hurt is that I'm not listened to in this relationship. That I'll say things, my partner asks me questions, and then when I give an answer, my partner immediately dismisses it. And so I don't feel like I'm actually valued or heard in this relationship. If they don't want to know my opinion, then why would they ask in the first place? And that's hurtful to me. And so the need is that I'm lacking validation from my partner. Validation that I've provided an answer that was actually valid, that was an honest answer. Now, it may not be completely applicable. They may not want to take my advice, but even just being able to acknowledge when they ask me my opinion on something and I gave it to them helps me feel seen in this relationship more. So I'm lacking a sense of validation. And so that is kind of an example of how you can fill out this grid. Think about the interaction that occurred with your partner. Think about the feeling that came up for you. Ask yourself, was this a primary or a secondary feeling? Often getting to the root of the problem, you're going to want to get past the reactive anger and get to some primary feeling. That primary feeling might be, well, I felt embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated. I felt hurt. I felt guilt. It's going to be some harder feelings that we often don't want to hold on to. And so we use another feeling to actually protect those more vulnerable feelings. So ask yourself, was my reaction a primary or a secondary feeling? And then finally, what's the story I'm telling myself about this feeling? If I drill down and I recognize that, well, I was actually hurt by my partner blowing off my comment, my suggestion when they asked me, then that hurt is going to tell you a story about your experience in this relationship. And you need to be able to tap into that. And so understanding, okay, what is the story I'm telling myself? Well, I'm telling myself that I am not seen and I'm not recognized and I'm not validated at times when I speak in this relationship. When I tell my partner something, they are very quick to dismiss it. And that is hurtful to me because they're my attachment partner. They're the ones I look to for that sort of validation more than anybody else in the world. And so there's an unmet need here for me. I need my partner to at least validate. They don't even have to agree, but they can at least validate that I've said something worthwhile. So I want you to try that exercise. And then once you do, I want you to be able to go to your partner and be able to communicate some themes that are coming up for you. So as you go through and you look at several interactions that you might have, that's why we did 5 lines in addition to those 5 columns that were coming up. So You look at 5 different events that are coming up for you or that have transpired with you and your partner, 5 different interactions, then you're going to be able to pick up on some themes. Do I often get hurt when my partner invalidates me? Yes, I do. Do I often react more with anger and I don't let my partner see the hurt? Yes, I do. Does that hurt usually tell me the same story? Yes, it does. It tells me that I'm not being seen and that there's a need that's not being met in my relationship by my partner. So then I want you to go and I want you to sit your partner down and I want you to walk through with your partner these different events that you have outlined and the themes that are coming together for you. And I want you to structure this no more than 15 minutes. And I want you to speak from your own sense of self. You are not here to blame your partner. You are not here to try to solicit advice or counsel from your partner. You are not trying to get their feedback. You just simply want to share this with them when you're not triggered and when you are not in a defensive place so that they can hear it better. So when you're describing this to them, you don't want to use a secondary emotion. You don't want to start getting angry. You want to stay in that primary emotion of hurt so they can hear you better. And you want to be able to walk this through with them and then be able to ask them, there's something that I'm missing that I would really like for you in this relationship. And I've only been able to recognize it by plotting these different themes. Could you please start validating more of the things that I'm saying to you, especially when you ask my advice or you ask my opinion? Would you please start, but before you go off and say the things, could you validate just what I'm saying? It would really help me. I think it would meet a need in this relationship. And then they can respond however they need to. But you just want them to listen. You want to structure this sit down with them. And you want to be able to sort of pull some of these events and examples together for them. This is very important. Now, the last thing I want to say is this might be really, really risky for people that are identifying traumatic themes for them. And so going and sitting down and talking with them could be extremely vulnerable. And if that is too scary for you, then don't do it. I'm not trying to re-traumatize anybody here. We're doing the opposite of that. I want to heal on this podcast, not re-traumatize anybody. So if that seems like a really risky thing for you, going and talking to your partner, then don't do it. You can simply fill out the sheet and identify these themes for you and try to get yourself into a place so that next time you don't respond with a secondary emotion, you respond with a primary emotion. And when you do that, what I think will happen is I think that you guys will get to the root of the issue much better, much quicker, and give yourselves a much bigger chance to repair those ruptures when they happen by getting to the root of the problem. Thank you so much for listening. I really enjoy all the feedback you guys have been getting. I really encourage you to continue giving feedback, and we're going to keep pushing these different topics out and hopefully are able to enrich you and enrich your relationships so we can start to prevent and build some trauma-free relationships out there. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming service.